My name is Maya Chen, and I was sitting in my car outside Morrison and Associates at 9:47 a.m. when I watched my entire family walk through the glass doors of what they believed was their company. The irony wasn't just bitter, it was surgical. They had scheduled another family meeting, another boardroom discussion about the future of grandfather's consulting empire, and once again, I hadn't received an invitation. For 3 years running, they'd gathered in that mahogany-paneled conference room to make decisions about a business that bore our blood, our legacy, our grandfather Henry Morrison's life work. And for 3 years running, they'd acted as if I didn't exist. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly imagined as they strutted through that lobby in their tailored suits and practiced confidence, was that the women they'd systematically erased from every family decision, every holiday dinner, every milestone celebration, held the keys to everything they thought they controlled. The coffee in my hands had gone cold as I watched my father, Robert, adjust his silver cufflinks, the same ones grandfather had left him. My mother, Linda, swept in behind him, her Hermes bag cutting through the morning air like a weapon she'd learned to wield with precision. My brother, David, followed, already pulling out his phone to check emails that would soon become meaningless. And my sister, Sarah, brought up the rear, her heels clicking against marble floors that echoed with the weight of decisions that would never be theirs to make. 3 years ago, everything changed with a single conversation. I had been working as a junior analyst at Morrison and Associates, trying to prove myself worthy of the family name, when I discovered something that would shatter their carefully constructed world. During a late-night audit of our client retention rates, I found discrepancies in our billing practices. Not small oversights, but systematic overcharging that had been happening for months. When I brought it to my father's attention, expecting praise for my diligence, I was met with something far different. "Maya, you don't understand how business works," he said, barely looking up from his newspaper. "These clients can afford it. We're providing premium services, and sometimes that means premium pricing adjustments." I stared at him across the breakfast table, my report still clutched in my hands. This wasn't premium pricing, this was fraud, plain and simple, and he was dismissing my concerns like I was a child asking naive questions about the world. "Dad, this isn't right. We're violating our contracts. If this comes out, it could destroy everything grandfather built." The silence that followed was arctic. My mother stopped stirring her coffee. David looked up from his tablet. Sarah paused mid-bite of her croissant. It was as if I had blasphemed in church, spoken words that simply weren't allowed in the sacred space of Chen family breakfast conversations. "Your grandfather," my father said slowly, each word measured in cold, "understood that survival requires adaptation. He would have done whatever was necessary to keep this company competitive." I felt something crack inside my chest, a fissure that would only widen in the months to come. This wasn't the man who had taught me to fish on Lake Michigan, who had helped me with homework at the kitchen table, who had once told me that integrity was the only inheritance that mattered. This was someone entirely. Someone who had been so consumed by maintaining appearances that he'd forgotten what they were supposed to represent. "I won't be part of this," I said, standing from the table. The words came out steadier than I felt. "I can't put my name on reports that I know are misleading clients." My father's laugh was bitter, dismissive. "Then perhaps Morrison and Associates isn't the right place for someone with such rigid ideals, Maya. The business world requires flexibility, Maya, something you've never quite grasped." The next morning, I submitted my resignation, not to my father but to Human Resources, through proper channels, with a copy sent to the board of directors. I detailed my concerns about billing practices and recommended an immediate audit of client accounts. I thought I was doing the right thing, protecting the company grandfather had built with his bare hands after returning from Korea. I thought integrity mattered more than family politics. I was naive enough to believe that truth would be welcomed, even celebrated. Instead, I was excommunicated. The family meeting stopped including me. Holiday invitations disappeared. My mother's birthday party happened without my knowledge. David's promotion celebration was a mystery I discovered through LinkedIn. Sarah's engagement announcement came through a Facebook post I wasn't tagged in. They had taken my moral stand and twisted it into betrayal, my whistleblowing into disloyalty, my principles into proof that I couldn't be trusted with family secrets. The worst part wasn't the silence. It was the narrative they crafted to justify it. I heard through mutual friends that they'd told everyone that I'd had a breakdown, that I'd become unstable and paranoid, convinced that the company was doing things wrong when I simply couldn't handle the pressure of real business decisions. They painted me as the weak link, the idealistic daughter who couldn't cut it in the corporate world, who had to be protected from herself and excluded for everyone's good. What they didn't know was that their exclusion had freed me in ways they couldn't imagine. Without the weight of family expectations, without the pressure to conform to their version of success, I had started my own consulting practice. Chen Strategic Solutions began in my Lincoln Park apartment with a laptop, a phone, and an unshakable belief that business could be done ethically without sacrificing profitability. I reached out to former Morrison & Associates clients who had been quietly frustrated with their service, offering them transparent pricing and honest assessments of their operational challenges. My first client was Patricia Williams, a small manufacturing company owner, who had been overcharged by Morrison & Associates for a market analysis that took me 3 weeks to properly complete. When I presented her with a comprehensive report for half the price Morrison had quoted, she stared at the document for a long moment before looking up at me with tears in her eyes. "This is exactly what I needed. Your family's company never listened to what I was actually asking for. They just gave me the same template they give everyone." Word spread quickly in Chicago's tight-knit business community. Within 6 months, I had 8 clients. Within a year, I hired my first employee, Marcus Webb. Brilliant strategist who had been overlooked at larger firms because he asked too many inconvenient questions about efficiency and ethics. Within 18 months, Chen Strategic Solutions was being recommended by clients to other business owners, and I was turning down projects because I couldn't handle the volume. The growth was intoxicating, but it was also lonely. Every milestone felt hollow because there was no one to share it with. When I landed my first Fortune 500 client, I reached for my phone to call my mother before remembering that we hadn't spoken in over a year. When Marcus and I celebrated our first $1 million year, I drove past the Highland Park house where I grew up, wondering if they'd be proud or threatened if they knew. When Chicago Business Journal featured Chen Strategic Solutions as one of the city's fastest-growing consultancies, I bought extra copies and left them unopened on my kitchen counter. The strangest part was how completely they had erased me. At industry events, I would occasionally run into David or Sarah, and they would look through me as if I were a stranger. When I was introduced to new contacts as Maya Chen, founder of Chen Strategic Solutions, I could see the moment of recognition followed immediately by deliberate ignorance. It was as if acknowledging my success would require admitting their mistake, and my family had never been good at admissions. But success has a way of creating its own momentum. My client base expanded beyond Chicago. Chen Strategic Solutions opened a satellite office in Milwaukee, then Detroit. We specialized in helping mid-sized companies optimize their operations without the corporate doublespeak that had become standard in the industry. Our motto, printed on every business card and displayed in every office, was simple: clear solutions, clear pricing, clear.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Results. It was everything Morrison & Associates wasn't, and the market responded accordingly. By the end of my second year in business, I had generated more revenue than I'd ever seen in my previous life. But money wasn't the real victory. The real victory was receiving emails from clients thanking me for saving their businesses, for giving them strategies that actually worked, for treating them like partners instead of revenue streams. The real victory was Marcus telling me that Chen Strategic Solutions was the first place he'd ever worked where he could sleep peacefully, knowing that everything we did could stand up to scrutiny. Still, there were nights when the silence felt crushing. Nights when I would scroll through Sarah's Instagram posts of family dinners I wasn't invited to, or see David quoted in business publications discussing Morrison and Associates' future plans as if he were the sole heir to grandfather's vision. Nights when I wondered if integrity was worth the isolation, if principles could really compensate for the loss of belonging. The answer came on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 3 years after I'd resigned from Morrison and Associates. I was in my office reviewing quarterly projections when my assistant knocked on my door. "Maya, there's an Eleanor Martinez on line 2. She says she's calling from Hoffman and Associates law firm about your grandfather's estate." My blood went cold. Grandfather Henry Morrison had died 5 years earlier, and his will had been read, his estate distributed. There shouldn't have been any outstanding legal matters, no unfinished business requiring attorney involvement. "Miss Chen." Eleanor Martinez's voice was crisp, professional, tinged with something I couldn't identify. "I apologize for the delay in reaching out. We've been handling a complex verification process regarding your grandfather's will, and I need to meet with you as soon as possible to discuss some discoveries that significantly impact your inheritance." The words didn't make sense. I had received my inheritance already, a small trust fund that had helped me start my business, some personal items, and a letter from grandfather encouraging me to follow my own path. My parents and siblings had inherited the bulk of his estate, including his controlling interest in Morrison and Associates. "I'm sorry, but I think there might be some confusion," I said. "My grandfather's estate was settled years ago. I received my portion already." Eleanor Martinez's pause was loaded with implications I couldn't understand yet. "Miss Chen, what I'm about to tell you will be quite shocking. The will that was read to your family was not your grandfather's final testament. We recently discovered a more recent, properly executed, and legally binding that fundamentally changes the distribution of his assets." The world seemed to tilt sideways. I gripped my desk, trying to process what she was saying. "What do you mean, a more recent version?" Another pause, this one almost sympathetic. "Your grandfather executed a new will 6 months before his death. In this document, he leaves you controlling ownership of Morrison and Associates, 80% of the company's shares to be exact. Your family currently believes they collectively own the business, but legally, you are the majority shareholder. The previous will they followed was superseded, and we've now completed the verification process to confirm the authenticity of the final version." I don't remember hanging up the phone. I don't remember Eleanor Martinez explaining the details of when and how we would meet or what steps needed to be taken to formalize the transfer. I sat in my leather chair, staring out at the Chicago skyline, trying to comprehend that the family who had excluded me, erased me, dismissed me as unstable and disloyal, had been operating under a fundamental misunderstanding for 3 years. They thought they owned grandfather's empire. In reality, I did. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, the same day I had watched them enter Morrison and Associates for another family meeting I wasn't invited to. Eleanor Martinez had suggested that I might want to inform my family of the situation beforehand to avoid unnecessary shock and drama. But as I sat in my car outside the building that now legally belonged to me, watching them disappear into elevators that carried them to boardrooms where they would make plans for a company they didn't actually control, I realized that some truths required the full weight of surprise to be properly appreciated. They had taught me that family loyalty meant accepting their version of reality without question. They had shown me that love was conditional on compliance, that belonging required silence about uncomfortable truths. Now it was time for them to learn what I had discovered over the past 3 years, that integrity has its own power, that principles have their own rewards, and that sometimes the person you dismiss as weak is actually the one holding all the cards. I finished my coffee, checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, and walked toward the entrance of Morrison and Associates.
Associates. It was time for a family meeting they would never forget. The security guard nodded at me with practiced politeness as I approached the Morrison and Associates reception desk. 23rd floor, mahogany and marble, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Michigan Avenue. This had been my world once, before I learned that familiarity could become a cage. The receptionist, a young woman I didn't recognize, smiled with corporate warmth as I approached her station. "Good morning. I'm here for the Chen family meeting," I said, keeping my voice level and professional. She glanced at her computer screen, her perfectly manicured fingers dancing across the keyboard with efficient precision. "I don't see your name on the list, Miss," she began, her smile faltering slightly as she searched for confirmation that matched her records. "Maya Chen," I replied simply. There might have been an oversight in the scheduling. The lie felt necessary, a small lubrication for machinery that was about to break down completely. She typed again, her brow furrowing with the concentration of someone trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. "I'm sorry, but I really don't show you registered for this meeting. Would you like me to call up to confirm?" Before I could answer, the elevator doors opened and David's wife Jessica emerged, looking harried and slightly out of breath. She was carrying a leather portfolio and checking her phone simultaneously, the kind of multitasking that had become second nature in our family's business circles. When she saw me standing at the reception desk, her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, then something approaching panic. "Maya," she said, her voice tight with surprise, "what are you doing here?" It was the first direct acknowledgement I had received from anyone in the family in months, and hearing my name spoken aloud in this context felt both validating and surreal. I had become so accustomed to being invisible that being seen felt almost aggressive. "I'm here for the family meeting," I said, maintaining the same professional tone I'd used with the receptionist. Jessica's eyes darted between me and the young woman behind the desk, as if she were calculating the social mathematics of a situation she hadn't been prepared to handle. "Maya, you know you're not—" She started, then stopped, apparently realizing that finishing that sentence would require acknowledging the deliberate nature of my exclusion. "Not what?" I asked, letting the question hang in the air between us. The receptionist watched our exchange with the fascination of someone witnessing a drama she hadn't expected to encounter during her morning shift. Jessica's professional composure was cracking slightly, revealing the discomfort that lay beneath her polished exterior. "Look, maybe we should go upstairs and sort this out," Jessica said finally, her voice carrying the kind of diplomatic smoothness that suggested years of navigating delicate family politics. "I'm sure there's been some kind of misunderstanding." The irony of her words wasn't lost on me. There had indeed been a misunderstanding, but not the kind she imagined. We rode the elevator in silence, the digital display counting floors with mechanical precision while tension built in the confined space between us. Jessica kept glancing at me sideways as if trying to decode my presence through careful observation. When the doors opened on the 15th floor where the executive conference rooms were located, I could hear voices echoing down the hallway, familiar voices discussing quarterly projections and market positioning with the confidence of people who believed they controlled their own destiny. "Before we go in," Jessica said, her hand hovering over the conference room door handle, "maybe you could help me understand what this is about. It's been a long time since you've been involved in family business discussions." Her tone was careful, diplomatic, but I could hear the underlying message: you don't belong here anymore, and we both know it. "Some things change, Jessica," I replied, "sometimes more than we realize." She studied my face for a moment, searching for clues to a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. Then she pushed open the door, and suddenly I was looking at the mahogany table where my family sat in their assigned seats, papers spread before them like battle plans, coffee cups and water glasses arranged with the precision of a formal dinner service. The conversation stopped immediately. David looked up from his laptop, his expression shifting from concentration to confusion to something approaching alarm. Sarah paused mid-sentence, her pen frozen over a legal pad covered with notes I couldn't read from the doorway. My father set down his reading glasses with deliberate slowness, his face settling into the mask of controlled displeasure I remembered from childhood disciplinary conversations. My mother didn't move at all, but her coffee cup trembled almost imperceptibly in her hands. "Maya," my father said, his voice carrying all the authority he'd cultivated over decades of boardroom negotiations. "This is unexpected." The understatement was almost comical. Unexpected was finding a different brand of coffee in the break room. This was seismic, unprecedented, a complete disruption of the carefully maintained equilibrium they'd spent 3 years perfecting. "Good morning, Dad," I said, stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind me. The conference room was exactly as I remembered. Oil paintings of Chicago landmarks, built-in bookshelves lined with business publications and industry awards, a view of the lakefront that I once had felt proud to be part of something larger than myself. Now it felt like visiting a museum dedicated to a life I'd once lived. "Good morning," David said, carrying the measured tone of someone trying to diffuse a situation without understanding its full implications. "This is a private family meeting about company business." He emphasized the word family in a way that made clear I was no longer considered part of that category. "I understand completely," I replied, taking the empty chair at the foot of the table. It felt appropriate, somehow, the position traditionally reserved for guests or junior associates, people who were present but not truly part of the inner circle. I wouldn't want to intrude on company business discussions. Sarah found her voice first, as she often did when family tensions reached uncomfortable levels. "Maya, we haven't spoken in years. Why are you here now?" Her question was direct, but not hostile, more puzzled than angry. Of all my siblings, Sarah had always been the most genuinely confused by our family's capacity for extended conflicts. "I received some interesting information yesterday," I said, keeping my voice conversational, almost casual, "about grandfather's will. Apparently there have been some
Developments that affect all of us. The words landed like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of confusion that spread across their faces in real time. Grandfather's will was settled years ago, my mother said, speaking for the first time since I'd entered the room. Her voice carried the crisp authority she'd always used when correcting what she perceived as factual errors. His estate was distributed according to his wishes. There are no outstanding issues. That's what I thought too, I agreed. Until Eleanor Martinez from Hoffman and Associates called me yesterday. Apparently, grandfather executed a new will 6 months before he died, one that significantly changes how his assets were distributed. The silence that followed was profound, the kind of quiet that occurs when people are processing information that doesn't fit into their existing understanding of the world. David was the first to respond, his lawyer's training kicking in automatically. "That's impossible. We were all present when the will was read. We saw the documents, the signatures, the witness statements. Everything was properly executed and legally binding." His confidence was absolute, built on years of experience with estate law and corporate documentation. "The will you heard was legally binding," I said. "It just wasn't the most recent one." Grandfather apparently had second thoughts about some of his decisions and made changes that weren't discovered until recently. I watched their faces carefully, noting the progression from confusion to concern to something approaching fear. "What kind of changes?" my father asked, his voice steady but cautious. He was a man who had built his career on understanding exactly where he stood in any given situation, and uncertainty made him visibly uncomfortable. "What exactly are you suggesting, Maya?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you what Eleanor Martinez told me. In grandfather's final will, the distribution of Morrison and Associates shares is very different from what we all believed." I paused, letting them absorb that information before delivering the rest. "According to the legal documentation, I am now the majority shareholder of this company." The reaction was immediate and varied. David's face went pale, his legal mind immediately grasping the implications of what I was saying. Sarah dropped her pen, the small sound echoing in the suddenly silent room. Jessica, who had been standing near the window, moved closer to the table as if she needed to hear my words more clearly. My mother's coffee cup finally completed its trembling journey and settled back onto its saucer with a soft clink. My father's response was characteristically direct. That's absolutely impossible. I've been running this company for 5 years based on the legal documentation that established our ownership structure. You received your inheritance, a trust fund, and some personal items. But business ownership was clearly delineated among the rest of the family. I thought so too, I said. But apparently grandfather's final wishes were different from what any of us understood. Eleanor Martinez has scheduled a meeting for this afternoon to review the documentation and explain the legal implications. She suggested I might want to inform the family beforehand to avoid unnecessary surprise. The understatement was intentional, a gentle irony that only I fully appreciated. This has to be some kind of mistake, Sarah said, her voice carrying a note of desperation that suggested she was beginning to understand the potential scope of what I was describing. Grandfather wouldn't have made such a dramatic change without telling anyone. He wasn't secretive about family matters. Was he? I asked quietly. Grandfather was a lot of things, but transparent about his business decisions wasn't one of them. He built this company by keeping his strategies private until he was ready to reveal them. Why would his estate planning be any different? The truth was, I had always been grandfather's favorite, though none of us had discussed it openly during his lifetime. He had been the one who taught me to read financial statements, who had explained the difference between revenue and profit using coins on his kitchen table, who had listened patiently when I asked questions about business ethics and corporate responsibility. While David and Sarah had seen Morrison and Associates as their birthright, I had seen it as grandfather's legacy, something to be protected and honored, not simply inherited. Even if what you're saying is true, David said, his voice taking on the measured tone he used when presenting legal arguments, there would be a process for challenging any will that seemed inconsistent with previous documented intentions. Estate law provides mechanisms for addressing documents that might have been executed under questionable circumstances. You're absolutely right, I agreed. If you believe grandfather's final will was executed improperly, you should definitely pursue legal challenges. Eleanor Martinez mentioned that the verification process took 3 years specifically because they wanted to ensure the documentation could withstand exactly that kind of scrutiny. The implication hung in the air between us. 3 years of verification meant 3 years of legal experts examining every aspect of the document's authenticity, 3 years of challenges and reviews and confirmations. If the will had survived that process, it was almost certainly bulletproof from a legal standpoint. This doesn't make sense, my mother said, her voice betraying the first hint of genuine emotion I'd heard from her since entering the room. Why would your grandfather change his will so dramatically without discussing it with anyone? Why would he leave the majority of the business to someone who had already left the company? The question struck at the heart of something I'd been wondering about myself. Why had grandfather made this change? What had motivated him to revise his estate planning so significantly in his final months? The answer, when it came to me, was both obvious and painful. Maybe, I said slowly, maybe he understood something about the direction the company was heading that made him reconsider his original plans. Maybe he saw what happened when I raised concerns about our billing practices and realized that the family's business priorities weren't aligned with his vision for Morrison and Associates. The accusation was subtle but inescapable. I was suggesting that grandfather had changed his will in response to their treatment of me, that my exclusion from the family had triggered his decision to exclude them from true ownership of his life's work. The implications were devastating, not just financially, but emotionally. That's a serious accusation, Maya, my father said, his voice carrying a warning tone I remembered from childhood arguments. You're suggesting that we somehow disappointed grandfather to the point where he would disinherit his own children and grandchildren. That's not just unlikely, it's insulting. I'm not suggesting anything, I replied. I'm simply sharing information about legal documents that apparently exist and have been verified. The motivations behind grandfather's decisions are something we'll probably never fully understand, but the legal reality is what it is. Jessica, who had been listening to our exchange with growing alarm, finally spoke up. What does this mean practically? If what you're saying is true, what happens to the company? What happens to everyone's jobs, their investments, their plans? Her questions were practical, immediate, focused on the concrete implications of a situation that seemed too surreal to be real. That's something we'll need to discuss, I said. But first, I think we should verify the information with Eleanor Martinez. She's requested a meeting with all of us this afternoon to review the documentation and explain the legal process for implementing grandfather's final will. The room fell silent again, but this time the quiet was different. Instead of shock or confusion, I sensed a kind of grim acceptance beginning to settle over them. They were starting to understand that this wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding, but a reality they would have to navigate whether they liked it or not. David pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly, presumably reaching out to his own legal contacts to begin understanding his options. Sarah stared at the table, her pen still lying where she dropped it, her notes about quarterly projections suddenly seeming irrelevant. Jessica moved to the window, her silhouette framed against the Chicago skyline, as she processed implications that extended far beyond the immediate family dynamics. My parents sat in their chairs at the head of the table, looking older than I'd ever seen them, weighed down by the realization that the foundation of their recent years had been built on incorrect assumptions. The company they'd been running, the decisions they'd been making, the future they'd been planning, all of it would need to be reconsidered in light of a legal reality that changed everything. "The meeting is at 3 o'clock, I said, standing up from my chair. "Eleanor Martinez's office is downtown, on LaSalle Street. She asked that all family members attend if possible." I paused at the door, looking back at the people who had shaped my childhood, who had taught me about business and responsibility and family loyalty, who then systematically excluded me when I tried to apply those lessons in ways they found inconvenient. For what it's worth, I didn't ask for this. I built my own company because I thought that was the only option you'd left me. But apparently, grandfather had other plans. Then I left them to process what I'd told them, to make whatever phone calls they needed to make, to begin understanding that the power dynamics in our family were about to shift in ways none of us had anticipated. As I walked back through the reception area, the young woman behind the desk smiled at me with renewed interest. Word would spread quickly through the office that something significant had happened in the executive conference room, that the family dynamics at Morrison and Associates were more complicated than anyone had realized. By tomorrow, the entire company would be buzzing with speculation about what Maya Chen's unexpected return might mean for their jobs, their projects, their futures. I stepped back onto Michigan Avenue, pulling my coat tighter against the October wind coming off Lake Michigan. 3 hours until the meeting with Eleanor Martinez. 3 hours for my family to research estate law, to make frantic phone calls to their lawyers, to begin understanding that their comfortable assumptions about ownership and control had been built on sand. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had excluded me from family meetings because they believed I couldn't be trusted with family business. Now it turned out that grandfather had trusted me with the most important family business of all, the future of Morrison and Associates itself. The question was what I would choose to do with that trust and whether the lessons I'd learned about integrity and ethics during my years of exile would translate into wisdom about power and responsibility. As I walked back to my own office, I realized that the hardest part of the situation wasn't going to be dealing with my family's anger or resentment. It was going to be figuring out how to use the unexpected gift grandfather had given me in ways that honored both his memory and my own principles. The company he built deserved better than the ethical shortcuts in family politics that had driven me away. The question was whether I could provide that better path, and whether my family would be willing to follow it. Eleanor Martinez's office occupied a corner suite on the 32nd floor of a glass tower that pierced the Chicago sky like a steel needle. The afternoon sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across a conference table that could have seated 20, but today held only 6. The lawyer herself was a woman in her early 50s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of presence that suggested decades of delivering news that changed people's lives forever. My family had arrived separately, each choosing their own method of processing the morning's revelations. David came with his own attorney, a thin man named Peterson, who carried himself with the nervous energy of someone operating outside his area of expertise. Sarah brought Tom, her husband, whose background in finance made him useful for understanding the economic implications of what we were about to discuss. My parents arrived together but sat apart. The distance between them suggested conversations that hadn't gone well. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, Eleanor began, her voice carrying the professional warmth of someone who understood the delicate nature of family legal proceedings. I know the situation is unexpected and potentially disruptive. My goal today is to provide you with complete transparency about the legal documents we verified and explain the process moving forward. She opened a thick folder and withdrew a document that looked official and intimidating, covered with legal seals and notarized signatures. This is Henry Morrison's final will and testament, executed on March 15th, 6 months before his death. It supersedes all previous wills and has been verified through extensive authentication processes, including handwriting analysis, witness interviews, and psychiatric evaluation to confirm Mr. Morrison's mental competence at the time of execution. The silence in the room was profound. Even David's attorney seemed to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented.
Legal revelation that would fundamentally alter everything they thought they knew about the Morrison family estate. The primary change from the previous will, Eleanor continued, concerns the distribution of Morrison and Associates' ownership. Where the earlier document divided company shares among Robert, David, and Sarah Chen, with smaller portions allocated to other family members, this final will grants 80% ownership to Maya Chen, with the remaining 20% distributed among the rest of the family. My mother's sharp intake of breath was audible across the room. 20%. After building their entire lives around the assumption that they collectively controlled grandfather's empire, they were learning that their actual ownership amounted to less than what I now held individually. The mathematics of power had shifted so dramatically that everything they'd planned, every decision they'd made, every assumption about their financial future needed to be reconsidered. This can't be legal, my father said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled anger that had always preceded his most devastating business negotiations. Estate law requires that major changes to inheritances be communicated to beneficiaries. You can't simply execute a secret will that disinherits children and grandchildren without following proper procedures. Eleanor nodded with the patience of someone who had anticipated this exact objection. You're absolutely correct about the communication requirements, Mr. Chen. However, the law doesn't require notification of will changes during the testator's lifetime. Henry Morrison was under no legal obligation to inform anyone about revisions to his estate planning. The document is properly witnessed, notarized, and executed according to Illinois state law. Peterson, David's attorney, leaned forward with the intensity of someone trying to find legal ground to stand on. What about the psychiatric evaluation you mentioned? If there were concerns about Mr. Morrison's mental state, that suggest potential grounds for challenging the document's validity. The psychiatric evaluation was conducted to confirm competency, not because there were concerns about it, Eleanor replied smoothly. Mr. Morrison requested the evaluation himself, apparently anticipating that his final will might be challenged. Dr. Rebecca Winters, a court-approved psychiatrist, conducted extensive testing and concluded that Henry Morrison was of sound mind and fully understood the implications of his estate planning decisions. The room fell silent again as the implications sank in. Grandfather hadn't just changed his will. He'd anticipated their objections and taken steps to ensure his final wishes couldn't be overturned. The level of planning suggested that this wasn't an impulsive decision made in his final months, but a carefully considered choice that he'd protected with legal safeguards. Why? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why would grandfather do this? What did we do wrong? The question carried a note of genuine anguish that cut through the legal technicalities and struck at the emotional heart of what we were all trying to understand. Eleanor's expression softened slightly. Mr. Morrison left a letter explaining his reasoning. Maya, he specifically requested that you read it aloud to the family when this moment came. She handed me an envelope with my name written in grandfather's distinctive handwriting, the same careful script I remembered from birthday cards and Christmas notes. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. Grandfather's words written in his final months felt like a voice reaching across time to deliver a message none of us had expected to hear. My dear family,
I began, reading aloud from grandfather's letter. If you are hearing these words, it means that my final will has been revealed and you are struggling to understand my decisions. I want you to know that nothing I have done was motivated by anger or disappointment, but by love and hope for the future of Morrison and Associates. I paused, looking around the table at faces that reflected confusion, hurt, and growing understanding. During my final year, I watched our family business with increasing concern. The billing practices that Maya brought to my attention were not isolated incidents, but symptoms of a larger problem. We had begun to prioritize profit over integrity, growth over ethics, family loyalty over moral responsibility. My father's face had gone pale, but he didn't interrupt. Sarah was crying quietly, tears she probably didn't realize she was shedding. David stared at the table, his legal mind undoubtedly processing the implications of grandfather's words. When Maya chose to leave the company rather than compromise her principles, I realized that she understood something the rest of us had forgotten. Morrison and Associates was built on the foundation of honest service and ethical business practices. Without that foundation, all our success becomes meaningless. The letter continued for several more paragraphs, explaining grandfather's reasoning with the careful logic of a man who had spent decades making difficult business decisions. He had watched the family's treatment of me after my resignation and concluded that they had prioritized maintaining comfortable illusions over addressing uncomfortable truths. My exclusion from family meetings and gatherings had convinced him that they were more interested in eliminating dissent than examining their own practices. I am leaving Maya the majority ownership of Morrison and Associates, not because I love her more than my other grandchildren, but because I believe she will protect the company's values, even when that protection requires difficult choices. She has already proven her willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for ethical principles. I trust her to make decisions that honor our family legacy rather than simply preserving our family wealth. When I finished reading, the conference room was completely silent except for the distant sound of traffic 32 floors below. Eleanor Martinez gave us time to process grandfather's words before speaking again. The legal transfer of ownership will take approximately 30 days to complete. During that time, Morrison and Associates will continue operating under its current management structure. After the transfer is finalized, Maya will have the legal authority to make decisions about the company's future, including management changes, operational modifications, and strategic direction. What does this mean for employees? Tom asked, speaking for the first time since we'd gathered. His question was practical, focused on the immediate implications for the dozens of people whose livelihoods depended on Morrison and Associates continuing to function. That will be Maya's decision, Eleanor replied, turning to look at me.
As the new majority owner, she'll have complete authority over company operations. The existing management team serves at her discretion. I felt the weight of their stares, the sudden realization that I held not just their financial futures, but the careers of everyone who worked for Morrison and Associates. The consulting firm that grandfather had built from nothing, that had employed our family and dozens of others for decades, was now my responsibility. I haven't made any decisions about operational changes, I said carefully. This situation is as unexpected for me as it is for all of you. I'll need time to understand the current state of the company and consider what changes, if any, might be necessary. Changes? My father asked, his voice sharp with alarm. Maya, this company has been profitable for 5 consecutive years under my leadership. Our client retention rates are above industry standards. Our revenue growth has exceeded projections every quarter. What changes could possibly be necessary? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications we both understood. He was asking whether I intended to dismantle everything he'd built, whether my return would mean the end of his role in the family business. But beneath that practical concern was a deeper fear.
that I might implement the ethical standards I'd advocated for years earlier, standards that could threaten the profitable but questionable practices that had driven their recent success. I don't know yet, I replied honestly. I'll need to review current operations, examine client relationships, and understand exactly how the company has been functioning. If there are practices that need to be modified to align with grandfather's original values, then yes, changes will be necessary. David's attorney whispered something urgently in his ear, probably advising him about legal options for challenging the will or protecting his interests during the transition period. But I could see in David's expression that he was beginning to understand the futility of fighting a document that grandfather had clearly protected against exactly those kinds of challenges. "What about our equity?" Sarah asked. "David and I have been building our financial plans around eventual inheritance of company ownership. Our investment portfolios, our children's education funds, our retirement planning, all of it was based on the assumption that we would inherit significant portions of Morrison and Associates." It was a fair question, with devastating implications. For years, they had lived with the comfortable assumption that grandfather's business would eventually provide them with financial security. They had made decisions about spending, investing, and career planning based on expected inheritance that now amounted to a fraction of what they'd anticipated. "The 20% ownership you'll retain represents significant value," Eleanor noted diplomatically. "Morrison and Associates is a profitable company with substantial assets. Your combined inheritance is still considerable by any reasonable standard." But we all understood the real mathematics. 20% divided among multiple family members meant individual stakes that were much smaller than anyone had expected. More importantly, without control of company decisions, their ownership stakes would be subject to whatever strategic direction I chose to pursue. "I want to propose something," I said, surprising myself with the words as they emerged. "Before we get caught up in legal battles or family conflicts, I think we should spend the next 30 days working together to understand the current state of Morrison and Associates. I want to audit operations, review client relationships, and examine our business practices. If there are problems that need to be addressed, we should address them together. If there are strengths that should be preserved, we should preserve them together." My father's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What exactly are you proposing, Maya? Some kind of collaborative transition? A joint management structure?" "I'm proposing that we spend the next month figuring out how to move forward in ways that honor both grandfather's wishes and the legitimate interests of everyone in this room. I didn't ask for this responsibility, but I'm not going to abuse it. If we can find ways to work together that maintain the company's ethical standards while protecting everyone's investments, that's what I'd prefer to do." The offer was genuine, though I wasn't entirely sure what it would look like in practice. Part of me wanted to storm into Morrison and Associates and implement sweeping changes that would purge every trace of the questionable practices that had driven me away. But another part of me recognized that destroying the company in order to save it would dishonor grandfather's memory and hurt innocent people who depended on Morrison and Associates for their livelihoods. "What guarantees do we have?" David asked, his legal training evident in the precision of his question. "If we cooperate with this transition process, what assurances do we have that our interests will be protected? What prevents you from simply using the next 30 days to gather information that you will then use to eliminate us entirely?" It was a lawyer's question, focused on protecting his client's position in what he clearly saw as a negotiation with an adversary. But it was also a brother's question, revealing the depth of mistrust that had developed between us over the years of silence and separation. "You don't have any guarantees," I replied honestly. "Just like I don't have any guarantees that cooperating with this process won't be used against me if you decide to challenge grandfather's will in court. We're all operating on faith that the people we used to love are still capable of acting with integrity even when the stakes are high. The reference to love was intentional, a reminder that underneath all the legal maneuvering and financial calculations, we were still family. We had shared childhoods and family vacations, graduation celebrations, and holiday traditions. The bonds that connected us had been strained by years of conflict, but they hadn't been completely severed. 30 days, my mother said suddenly, speaking for the first time since Eleanor had been explaining the legal documents. You're asking for 30 days of cooperation before you make any major decisions about the company's future? I'm asking for 30 days of honesty, I corrected. Cooperation would be nice, but honesty is essential. I need to understand exactly how Morrison and Associates has been operating, what our current client relationships look like, and whether there are practices that need to be modified to align with grandfather's original values. Then yes, changes will be necessary.
Minutes would determine whether this inheritance transfer would proceed smoothly or devolve into years of bitter litigation. I should mention, she said diplomatically, that prolonged legal challenges rarely benefit anyone except the attorneys involved. The documentation supporting this will is extremely thorough, and Mr. Morrison clearly anticipated potential objections. The message was clear. Fighting the will would be expensive, time-consuming, and ultimately futile. Better to work with the new reality than exhaust their resources fighting a battle they were unlikely to win. I need to discuss this with my own legal counsel, David said, glancing at Peterson for confirmation. 30 days isn't very long to conduct the kind of comprehensive review Maya is describing. If we're going to open our books and operations to that level of scrutiny, I want legal protections in place. That's reasonable, I agreed. Eleanor, can you help us draft an agreement that protects everyone's interests during the review period? Something that ensures transparency from all parties while preventing anyone from using the information inappropriately? She nodded. I can have a preliminary agreement ready by tomorrow morning. It would establish the scope of the review process, define everyone's obligations during the 30-day period, and provide legal protections for all parties involved. As we prepared to leave Eleanor's office, I realized that the easy part was over. Delivering shocking news and processing legal documents was simple compared to what came next. Actually working together to understand and potentially transform a company that had been shaped by years of family conflict and competing priorities. The elevator ride down 32 floors was silent, each of us lost in private calculations about what the next month would bring. When we reached the lobby, my family scattered to their separate cars and separate lives, leaving me standing alone on LaSalle Street with the weight of grandfather's legacy settling around my shoulders like an expensive coat I wasn't sure I deserved to wear. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tomorrow, I would walk into Morrison and Associates, not as the excluded daughter or the principled whistleblower, but as the majority owner of a company that now belonged to me. The question was whether the lessons I'd learned during 3 years of exile had prepared me for the responsibilities of power, and whether my family would choose to help me honor grandfather's trust or force me to exercise that power alone. The first morning of my 30-day review period, I arrived at Morrison and Associates at 6:30 a.m., 2 hours before the official start of business. The building's lobby was empty, except for security guards and maintenance crews, their quiet efficiency creating an atmosphere of anticipation that matched my own nervous energy. I had requested complete access to company records, financial statements, client files, and operational data. What I discovered over the following weeks would reshape not just my understanding of the family business, but my perception of the people I thought I knew. Marcus Webb had agreed to assist with the audit, bringing his analytical expertise and objective perspective to a situation that was anything but objective for me.
We established ourselves in a conference room adjacent to the executive offices, surrounding ourselves with bankers' boxes full of documents that told the story of Morrison and Associates' evolution over the past 3 years. What emerged from those files was a picture of systematic ethical compromises that went beyond the billing irregularities I had discovered years earlier. The overcharging I had identified had just been the beginning. Under my father's leadership, Morrison and Associates had developed what could only be described as a predatory relationship with smaller clients. Companies struggling with operational challenges were sold expensive consulting packages that provided minimal value, while larger corporate clients received preferential treatment that bordered on the unethical. Internal emails revealed discussions about maximizing extraction from clients who were unlikely to challenge invoices or demand detailed accountability for services rendered. David had been instrumental in developing legal frameworks that technically protected the company from fraud charges while enabling practices that violated every principle grandfather had instilled in the business. Sarah had managed client relationships with a focus on emotional manipulation, using personal connections and family emergencies to extract additional payments from clients who couldn't afford extended consulting engagements. The picture that emerged was of a family business that had systematically abandoned its founding values in pursuit of short-term profitability. But the most devastating discovery came in the form of a private email chain between my parents and siblings dated just weeks after my resignation. The messages revealed the deliberate nature of my exclusion from family events and business discussions. They hadn't simply forgotten about me or assumed I was no longer interested in family affairs. They had actively conspired to erase me from family narratives, telling extended relatives and family friends that I had suffered a mental breakdown and required professional treatment for delusional thinking. Maya has always been unstable. My mother had written to my Aunt Dorothy. The pressure of real business responsibilities triggered some kind of paranoid episode. She started seeing ethical violations everywhere, accusing us of fraud and demanding investigations that would have destroyed the company for no reason. We've had to limit her access to family gatherings until she gets the psychological help she needs. The lies were sophisticated and comprehensive, designed to discredit any attempt I might make to reconnect with extended family or challenge their version of events. They had weaponized mental health stigma to justify my exclusion, turning my principled stand into evidence of psychological instability. Reading those emails, I felt a cold rage that had nothing to do with business ownership and everything to do with the systematic destruction of my reputation and relationships. Marcus found me staring at my laptop screen, tears of rage streaming down my face as I processed the full scope of what my family had done. "Maya, you're reading something. Maybe you should take a break. We've been at this for 12 hours straight." They told everyone I was mentally ill. For 3 years, they've been telling relatives and family friends that I had a psychotic break, that I was delusional and paranoid and dangerous to be around. That's why no one from the extended family reached out to me. That's why I've been completely isolated. Marcus sat down beside me, his expression shifting from concern to anger as he understood implications of what I was describing. "Maya, that's not just family conflict. That's character assassination. It's deliberate defamation designed to isolate you from your support systems." The worst part was understanding how effective their strategy had been. For 3 years, I had wondered why cousins and aunts and family friends had stopped responding to my occasional emails or phone calls. I had assumed they were simply following my parents' lead and cutting contact. But the reality was much more sinister. They had been told that I was mentally unstable and potentially dangerous, that attempting to maintain relationships with me would be enabling my delusions and preventing me from getting the help I needed. "We need to document all of this," Marcus said. his business analyst instincts taking over. If they've been systematically defaming your character while simultaneously engaging in unethical business practices, that creates legal exposure that goes beyond corporate governance issues. Over the following days, we expanded our investigation to include not just business practices, but the broader pattern of deception that had characterized my family's behavior since my resignation. What we found was a comprehensive campaign of reputation destruction that had effectively erased me from our social and professional circles. Former colleagues at Morrison and Associates had been told that I was receiving psychiatric treatment for work-related stress. Family friends had been informed that I was too unstable for social interactions. Even my college roommates had received calls from my mother expressing concern about my mental health and suggesting that contact with old friends might interfere with my recovery. The psychological impact of discovering this systematic deception was almost overwhelming. Every moment of isolation, every unanswered email, every missed invitation that I had attributed to natural family dynamics had actually been the result of deliberate manipulation. They hadn't just excluded me from family meetings, they had orchestrated my exclusion from every meaningful relationship in my life. But alongside the rage and hurt, I felt something else, a cold clarity about what needed to happen next. Grandfather's final will hadn't just given me ownership of Morrison and Associates, it had given me the power to address 3 years of ethical violations and restore the company to its founding principles. More importantly, it had given me the platform to correct the lies that had destroyed my relationships and reputation. When the 30-day review period ended, I called a company-wide meeting. Every employee of Morrison and Associates gathered in the main conference room, from senior partners to administrative assistants, unsure of what to expect from the woman who had unexpectedly inherited control of their workplace. My family sat in the front row, their faces reflecting various combinations of anxiety, resentment, and resignation. 3 weeks ago, I began, I learned that my grandfather had named me as majority owner of Morrison and Associates. Since then, I've conducted a comprehensive review of company operations, client relationships, and business practices. What I've discovered requires immediate and significant changes to how this company operates. The room was completely silent, dozens of people holding their breath as they waited to learn whether their jobs would survive whatever transformation I was about to announce. I had spent sleepless nights considering my options, weighing the competing demands of justice, forgiveness, and practical business considerations. Effective immediately, Morrison and Associates will implement new ethical guidelines that align with the principles my grandfather established when he founded this company. We will conduct comprehensive audits of all client accounts to identify overcharges or billing irregularities, and we will provide full refunds where appropriate. We will revise our service agreements to ensure complete transparency in pricing and deliverables, and we will establish an independent ethics board to review our practices and ensure ongoing compliance with both legal requirements and moral standards. The announcement sent ripples of concern through the assembled employees. Refunding overcharges could impact the company's profitability and potentially threaten job security. But I had anticipated these concerns and developed a comprehensive plan to address them. I understand that implementing these changes will require financial sacrifices, I continued. To minimize the impact on employees and operations, I will be investing additional capital into the company to cover transition costs and maintain salary levels during the restructuring period. No employee will lose their job as a result of ethical compliance measures. The relief in the room was palpable, but I wasn't finished. The business changes were only part of what needed to be addressed. I also need to discuss some personal matters that have affected this company's culture and my family's relationships, I said, turning to look directly at my parents and siblings. Over the past 3 years, false information about my mental health and personal stability has been deliberately spread throughout our professional and social communities. These lies were designed to isolate me from relationships and discredit any concerns I might raise about business practices. My father's face had gone pale, but he didn't interrupt. Sarah was staring at her hands, unable to meet my eyes. David had the expression of someone realizing that a situation was about to become much more worse than he had anticipated. Moving forward, Morrison and Associates will operate with complete transparency and honesty, not just in our client relationships, but in all our professional and personal interactions. Anyone who continues to spread false information about any member of this company will face immediate termination. The message was clear. The culture of deception and manipulation that had characterized the company's recent operations would not be tolerated under my leadership. But more than that, I was publicly correcting the record about my mental health and establishing clear consequences for anyone who attempted to continue the defamation campaign.
Separate from business decisions, you'll destroy Morrison and Associates if you let personal grievances